Final Fantasy XVI takes the series in what you could call a bold direction. Previous games have pushed the series in a more action-focused direction for a while now, even trying to infuse the ATB system in Final Fantasy XIII with flashy, action-moving-inspired visuals. While this is a far cry from the turn-based route of the franchise, it's not exactly a surprising one. Final Fantasy has been evolving for pretty much its entire existence, as early as the ATB system introduced in Final Fantasy IV, which in my opinion turned the combat into something other than turn-based due to the real-time nature of the system. The identity of this series is so muddled too, gameplay doesn't exactly define it, otherwise everything past FF3 wouldn't count. It can't just be the setting, otherwise 7, 8, 10, 13, 15 all wouldn't count due to not being in a medieval era fantasy setting. Heck, I can even see someone whose first exposure to the series was 7 and 8, with their more modern, almost sci-fi settings, could feel like the series doesn't supply what they liked about those games. All this to say that I don't think the action gameplay of Final Fantasy XVI disqualifies it from being a Final Fantasy game. The identity of the series is in its spirit, in its recurring themes and iconography, and I think this game has all that in spades. Creative Business Unit 3 has shown in Final Fantasy XIV how much they love this series, with how much of a love letter that game sometimes feels, and I feel that same care and love for this series in 16, even as they steer it in a more maturely themed direction. 16 is the first game in the mainline series to feature a mature 18+ rating. This is mostly due to the use of bloody violence, swearing, and a bit of nudity. None of this is used gratuitously, but is instead used to help tell this more mature themed story. None of it is used purely for shock value, apart from maybe during the intro, but that's clearly on purpose, and the swearing especially feels quite natural to me. I'm a Brit, so hearing swearing in casual conversation is part of the course, even if maybe to non-natives it seems a bit excessive in places. The main driving point for this decision, according to producer Yoshi P, was to grow the series and to age it up a bit alongside its audience. A lot of people that have followed the series for a while now are probably in their late 20s or 30s, so having a character and themes more aimed at someone of that age seems fitting. The big question though is how I find it as a game and how would I compare it to previous entries in the series. Let's dig into it, shall we? Starting with the first thing you'll notice, the graphics. Visually, Final Fantasy XVI is at times jaw-dropping. Characters are extremely well detailed and are made all the more impressive when you consider basically all the cutscenes in the game are rendered in real time. The biggest slight in the visuals, I suppose, are seen in what you'd call the B-tier cutscenes. The ones that aren't important enough to get the big fancy motion captured animations such as in side quests or miscellaneous dialogue with various NPCs. The lip sync is obviously patchy and make use of stock animations, so they look noticeably worse than the fancier ones. However, I still think these don't look bad. If we compare these directly to the equivalent kind of cutscene in Final Fantasy 15 or even 7 Remake, these look a lot better in comparison. Sure, they're not amazing looking, nor are they always using the most interesting camera work, usually it's just a shot reverse shot. What's there is considerably more polished than the 15 though, which has much worse and important looking NPCs. Heck, even characters that are introduced in the main story of 15 can look pretty garbage. Take Dave for example. I keep raining on this guy, but he looks awful, especially in comparison to how good the main characters look. I don't think this is the same problem in 16. Obviously the detail of these NPCs aren't as good as Clive or his companions, but they still look pretty decent in my opinion, with more convincing looking faces and decent texture work. It's not just the characters that look good though. The world and visual effects are of really high quality. The world looks natural and lived in, there's detail in the environments that makes sense and can hint at what's happened before your arrival. One detail I noticed, for example, a late game one so I won't show it, was coming across abandoned army camps with weapons dropped everywhere on the ground. This hints to what happened in the story that led to this army quickly abandoning the camp, so I thought it was a nice touch and it added to the immersion of that moment. The effects during gameplay are also awesome. Using the abilities always looks and feels good. They're animated well and the effects fill the screen with fancy particle effects while still keeping the battlefield easy enough to read. I was actually a little skeptical of this particular part of the presentation before the game released, as the explosion of particle effects in the trailers made it look really hard to follow. I was quite pleasantly surprised to find that that wasn't the case, and being in control of it all felt perfectly fine and could keep up with pretty much every combat encounter. I've seen rumblings about regarding the motion blur in the game though. At times I understand it, I think. When you move the camera, especially in quite noisy scenes in a forest or something, the screen can turn into a bit of a blurry mess that makes it hard to focus on. I mostly didn't notice it though, apart from when it would behave a little weirdly, like creating ghosting when panning Clive's head over while looking over water or something. And at 30 FPS, the effect is honestly quite pleasant 90% of the time, I'd say, especially in high action scenes. There is an option patched in now so you can adjust this. I tried turning it off and I thought it looked awful at 30 FPS, but maybe I was just used to it too. Nice to finally have the option for people though. The true visual centerpieces are the icon battles. I looked forward to seeing these as they went on. In some, the gameplay is limited, mostly early on in the game where the set pieces have the heaviest usage of cinematic battle prompts, but goddamn, they prompt some incredible action sequences. They're well framed, well paced, and absolutely gorgeous. These were the visual treats of the game, and they basically never disappointed. The last point I'll make on the graphics is regarding the 2 visual modes in the game. I've spent a large chunk of this section praising the graphics, and I genuinely think this is, by and large, an amazing looking game. I played it 100% through in the quality mode. This targets 4K but with a 30 FPS camp. The other mode, Performance, targets a lower resolution, 1440p I think, but aims for a 60 FPS target. Something looked off about it to me when I tried the demo though, and I found out why. In battle, the internal resolution of the game lowers in Performance mode. This results in a solid 60 FPS, but the resulting image can look a bit blurry in some overly busy environments. It looks fine for the most part, to be honest. My second New Game Plus playthrough in the harder difficulty mode is being done exclusively in Performance mode. But for a game that looks as gorgeous as this, I think it's worth playing for the first time with the best presentation you can muster. Another issue with the Performance mode is the stability of the frame rate outside of battle. It's almost always over 30, but can fluctuate in the 40s and 50s, making the game look distractingly unstable. To my eye, anyway. The graphics mode, while it targets 30 FPS, so is lower all round, is far more stable and gives the game a more consistent look. I would recommend this being the mode people play the game on. Your inner gamer may scream at you about the lower frame rate, but trust me that your eyes will get used to it quickly, and you'll barely notice it after a while. The stability helps a lot too, it's a rock solid 30 FPS. So, as you may have gathered, the gameplay of 16 isn't quite the typical Final Fantasy fare. It's different from the other action-based Final Fantasy games too. 15 had a strange weapon swapping mechanic with orders for Noctis' friends being on a timer activated with the D-pad. A criticism of that game's combat system is that it gets negated by item spam, and so, while it doesn't feel right to do, you can brute force your way through and just hold circle. This doesn't feel like playing the game right, but I can't deny that it works. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a bit more of a straight action game, a simple one that has abilities that you can use as you build up a timer, that you can select from a menu while the action slows to a crawl. It's also focused on using these abilities and defending at the right times due to the presence of instances of unavoidable damage. The game isn't overly reliant on reaction times due to the fact that you can slow down the action with the menu. It's great though, I really like the Final Fantasy VII combat mechanics. This is where 16 diverges from these two titles. This game makes use of a proper action game mechanics, becoming something somewhat reminiscent to character action games such as Devil May Cry. That comparison is more apt one too, since the combat director of DMC5 was the lead combat designer of 16. While on the surface the combat looks very similar to DMC, playing it tells a different story. There are definitely similarities, that's for sure. The perfect dodges, the flow of combos, even some of the combat abilities have direct analogues to DMC. However, if you play DMC, you'll notice that Final Fantasy has more weight to it. It's hard to describe, but if you play DMC 5, you can feel the difference straight away. Nero or Dante in DMC feel a lot lighter to move around, and their attacks and combos move at a blinding pace. I really disagree with the notion that these games are button mashers too. I feel that comes from ignorance, or they only ever played the games on the easiest difficulty or something. Styling in DMC, and even in Final Fantasy 16, not only leads to higher ranking scores, but can also help you deal more damage by being able to stick to the enemy for longer, with more instances of damage than simply mashing square. Regardless, Final Fantasy 16 is like DMC, but not. As I said, the combat feels more weighty, Clive isn't as nimble on his feet as the DMC protagonists, and he also doesn't have access to all of his unlocked abilities at once, meaning that there's more forethought involved with approaching battle in this game. By the end of the game, Dante would have access to all of his different styles, weapons, and unlocked skills at once, which he can switch between and pull off at will with the correct inputs. For Clive, he can equip 3 different inherent icon abilities, and up to 2 skills for each, with the option to spend enough ability points on one skill to use it with any icon. The skills in Final Fantasy XVI aren't just damage too, a lot of them have different utilities. Garuda's abilities focus more on hits to drain will or build stagger faster, as well as having unparalleled airborne utility. Phoenix focuses more on closing the gap to an enemy and unleashing high damage abilities. In contrast, Bahamut is more focused on dodging and keeping the enemy at bay until you unleash a charged up Mega Flare. This is the heart of the combat of Final Fantasy XVI. The character building, the thing that makes this an action RPG rather than a straight action game like DMC, is this focus on making a loadout. How I play Clive may totally differ from you by the end of the game based on the iconic abilities that you like, as well as how you level up the skills and which ones you have equipped. The only constant is the core abilities like the combo with Magic Burst, the Gap Closer, or the aerial juggle with Slam Down. These are the filler abilities while waiting for the next skill to come off cooldown though, and are definitely not the core of the experience in my opinion. These are used to keep damage up, to crowd control, or to position for better use of the abilities. Crowd control abilities aren't as valuable in boss fights, which are by and large one-on-ones, but they can offer escapes from attacks while outputting your own damage. A fair few times I made use of Garuda's Wicked Wheel ability to lift either into the boss's face, or to avoid a sweep I knew was coming while whittling away at their health and will. The boss fights are the test of mechanic avoidance and damage output, especially when they're staggered, so they play in a different manner to normal fights. Punishing openings is the name of the game. Normal enemies are a test of crowd control rather than the avoidance of mechanics and attacks. I don't see this as a problem per se, and is how the same gameplay is freshened up between encounters, as the boss fights are quite a change of pace compared to everything else. So, in short, I think the combat is very engaging, and this style of combat for this game was a great choice. The other big part of the gameplay, I suppose, is the icon battles you fight throughout the story. There's a good amount of them, and are usually cutscenes with cinematic action button prompts interspersed with decent length action gameplay while playing as Ifrit. They start relatively simple, but as Clive gains more control of the fiery icon over the story, the gameplay becomes more like a hyped up version of Clive's normal moveset. The gameplay is limited, but I didn't mind at all. Each icon fight plays slightly differently too, so there's always surprises to come, and I enjoyed pretty much every single one. That isn't to say that I don't think this game in terms of gameplay is exempt from criticism though. I feel like the rate at which you get access to new abilities is a tad too slow at the start of the game, with a majority of the first half of the game only having access to Phoenix and Garuda skills. This does help you get into the rhythm of this combat system, and the acquisition of new pools of skills are linked directly to the story, however it can feel a little limiting at the start regardless. Side quests, while I think they have a lot of worth for the most part in terms of the story and world building, the quests themselves are quite simple in terms of gameplay. I think it's a fair criticism to point out that the side quests mostly involve picking up an item or killing a weak group of monsters. Very simple stuff. However, I think on the other side of that coin, it's also fair to say that the side quests do add a lot to the world of the game. Some are very good in terms of the story, and some end with a cool boss fight. I can't deny that most are quite mind-numbing outside of the window dressing though. However, I'm not sure what a good solution to this would be. It's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I think narratively they mostly serve a good purpose, but I have no idea what kind of gameplay they could have to make them more engaging in a purely gameplay sense. Luckily, I'm not a game designer. The other big issue with the side quests is the pace at which they become available. They usually unlock in groups as you progress through the story. As the story goes on though, they unlock in greater numbers until the last batch right before the end, which unlocks access to about 8 or more maybe at once. These are some of the best side quests in the game. They have a development for various side characters and even some for the main characters too, which flesh out the story somewhat. However, these all come right before the climax of the story where it feels quite urgent to, get your skates on and finish the fight. It's a fitting time for story threads to wrap up, but I think maybe some of these should have come about earlier and replace some of the chaff. A good third of the side quests could be removed with not much lost really, and could have resulted in a better paced complete playthrough. As it stands though, the presence of the side quests can hurt the pacing of the story somewhat. Not enough to loathe them. I enjoyed the narrative value of most of them enough to not think that far, but certainly enough for me to think that there could have been a little less of them. I do wish there was more stuff to do in the world outside of side quests and hunts. The hunts are amazing, don't get me wrong though. Most of them are an archetype of an enemy you've seen before, however they usually have an extra mechanic to throw you off, an ability the other enemies of its type doesn't have. There's 32 of them, and I wish there was more. I'm quite surprised there's no super boss or anything though. There was even one in Final Fantasy 15. The Ultimate Hunt was a joke you could kill in the post-game of the vanilla version with the ring ability, but they added a proper super boss in the Royal Edition of 15 at least. In 16 you can get the best gear of the game and only really have the final story boss to use it on, or the first few bosses of New Game Plus. The highest level hunt I fought and killed at level 42 I think, and they weren't even the last hunt to unlock. It was a great fight though. This leads me on to my last bit of criticism, which is that the gearing and crafting aren't great. The crafting feels very half-baked really. Throughout the game you find materials in either boxes or just as shiny sparkles on the side of the road. In my experience though, you'll never be wanting for any of these materials because there's nothing to make with them. This does feed into another criticism in that there's not much reward for exploration. The environments are gorgeous and there's plenty of things to look at off the beaten path, but you won't be rewarded mechanically for it. 90% of the stuff you find on the side are these almost meaningless crafting materials or very small handfuls of gil. The major upgrades to your weapons and armor are mostly from materials dropped by story bosses or hunts or side quests. Other than those, the materials you'll have hundreds of by the end are just kind of useless. You can't craft potions or buff tonics or anything like that. They're just there. Weapons and armor are just has more damage stats or has more defense and a bit of more added health. And that's it. No special effects or any reason to take one armor over another. Those effects are mostly on the accessories, which opens up the character building a little bit, but not by much. The majority of accessories you'll find are either lower the cooldown or increase the damage of a specific ability. A few more increase the defense or attack, and a few more increase the rate you earn XP or AP. I can see cases of you really wanting to use a specific ability a lot and building the accessories around that, but there's almost zero content that really requires it. Speedrunning potential there though, maybe, or maybe not. One of the core pillars of any Final Fantasy is a compelling story. Now, not every single entry has been amazing at this. 13 had some issues with its world building being hidden mostly in data logs, and 15 had its issues of part of the story being told outside material, or even demos. Despite their flaws, both of those games still told emotionally compelling stories with characters that people still love to this day. Heck, what separated the original Final Fantasy from its bigger competitor Dragon Quest was the presence of some sort of story, as thin as it was. Final Fantasy XVI holds up this pillar of the series the highest of them all. This game is extremely story focused and it's gripping from the off. The story takes place in the land of Valisthea, a land ever locked in conflict, and an ever-advancing blight which sucks the land dry of magic, and with it, life. Conflicts arise over what's left of the fertile land, sometimes boiling to the point where they unleash their nation's dominant on the battlefield to do battle with their icon. Dominants are able to transform into their icon, taking the form of classic Final Fantasy summons such as Titan, Ramuh, and Shiva. These icons are massive though, towering over most of everything else around them and bringing devastation to the battlefield. As such, they are often used as last resorts, or only come out to counter the use of an opposing icon. The blight ever advances though, and the amount of hospitable land seems to get swollen up more with each passing day. The Mother Crystals supplied the people with the magic they need to get through their day-to-day, such as starting fires or light to keep the streets lit at night. With the blight seemingly sucking up the land of its ether and with it its magic, the crystals are starting to be more in demand. This is where bearers come in. These are people who have natural magical abilities, nothing like the dominants, but are able to light a spark or form a stream of wind. These people are enslaved at the first sign of showing magical attunement, branded, and subjected to slavery, considered less than human. A large part of the conflict within the main narrative is addressing this clear injustice within the society of the game world. Everyday folk are used to treating these people inhumanely. They're indoctrinated by the powers that be that this is the right thing to do. Despite this, some nations treat their bearers with more respect, even if they still participate in this messed up part of society. The Grand Duchy of Rosario is one such nation, and Clive Rosfield, our protagonist, is the son of the king. His brother is the dominant of the Phoenix and is therefore the next in line for the throne. This aspect of the world they live in is something Clive has to grapple with throughout the story, his experiences over the years shaping his opinion of the world and how to fix it. Clive also, selfishly, seeks revenge for an attack on his nation in the prologue, which results in tragedy, his nation as he knew it all but destroyed, and family killed, subjected to years of servitude and hatred. This is a complex narrative with a fair bit of depth to it to dive in where you see fit. The story of 16 takes reference of Game of Thrones partly, as well as influence from prior Final Fantasy games, especially 12 and Tactics. This inspiration mostly comes in the form of political intrigue, which is a heavy driving force for a majority of the story. The movements of the various nations happen for reasons that vary politically, to push further into more fertile hostile lands, to usurp power from beneath a weak ruler, or to remove those deemed undeserving. Everything happens for a reason, and with care put into their reasoning. To help you navigate this web of intrigue, you meet an NPC in the mid-game or so who can show you a timeline of movements of the various nations, breaking down what was happening and why, showing the movements of the armies. It's really awesome to see a world-building tool like this built into the game and can help you fully understand what happens in the story outside of the immediate goings-on with Clive. A very similar tool is available for the lore of the game too. You meet a character early on, Harpocrates, or Tomes as is known, who not only has a pretty cool name, but also allows you to read lore entries of a lot of the events and characters you meet throughout the story. You can access these entries in cutscenes too through what they call active time lore, by holding down the touchpad on the controller. This will show related lore entries regarding what's going on in the story at that time. If a character is speaking in a cutscene, for example, you could get a refresher on what you know about them there and then if you wanted. I didn't make much use of this personally, as accessing this feature does break the flow of the cutscenes, but when you come back to the hideaway, you can speak to Tomes to read all the entries you've gathered so far. The interface is amazing. It breaks down all the entries into different categories, and reading an entry will have suggested relating topics underneath if you wish to dig further. It's an impressive database and a fantastic resource. I hope other games use this idea in the future too, as it's such a great idea. Especially in a game like this, where the lore is dense and also deeply important to the plot. Speaking of lore, this is where the side quests shine. Sure, in terms of gameplay, they kinda suck really. However, the value when it comes to world building far outweighs that if I'm honest. Let's take the first few side quests you get as an example, as it's also the ones people point to when they mention the bad side quest gameplay. One is to simply collect soil from a vineyard and bring it to the gardener in the hideaway. The quest itself is a fetch quest, simple as. Maybe you kill a few wolves. The point of the quest though is to show that despite the uninhabitable conditions the hideaway is based in, the people there have still found a way to grow their own fruit and vegetables, which as far as the general populace of the world is concerned should be impossible. Another is the one where you're tasked with simply taking hot meals to 3 bearers in the dining hall. The gameplay is simply going to 3 NPCs and interacting with them, then the quest done. Again, the context is important though. The idea here is that it shows how well treated these ex-slaves are being treated, as well as showing their appreciation for something as simple as a hot meal, which hints to the abuse they've suffered through most of their lives. One is even bettering himself by burying himself into books and learning of the world. Not every quest is massively important, and not all add context that's needed really either, but doing them helps your understanding of the world, and by the end also may help you understand the ending better too. In the late game, there are quests which are much more involved. These even end with the higher quality cutscenes. The later game's side quests also involve major characters and add to their development, making them worth doing for that reason too. By and large, the voice acting for these NPCs are great too. I never thought I'd remember some of these recurring side characters, but thanks to the writing and above average voice acting, I remember and actually like a fair few of them. The side quests here have actually made me think less of Final Fantasy 15 in retrospect, as I'd forgotten how bad they were in that game. Between their terrible voice acting, low detail character models, and extremely tedious quest design, the fact that in 15 they didn't even really add to the world building like they do in 16 is insane to me. If you think the 16 side quests are bad because they may sometimes be simple fetch quests, come back to me after going out to catch a bunch of frogs for a quest in 15 and tell me which you prefer. The main story of Final Fantasy 16 focuses primarily on Clive Rossfield, the story taking place in his teens, his 20s, and his early 30s. This makes him one of the oldest protagonists in the series. Ironically not canonically much younger than Cid in Final Fantasy VII. Thus people in their 30s were obviously considered ancient by older JRPG standards, I guess. Nice to know I'm in my twilight years. Clive's older age was chosen due to the nature of the themes in Final Fantasy XVI, namely revenge, regret, trauma, responsibility, themes which fit an older, less angsty protagonist more than a plucky teen. Granted, Final Fantasy hasn't shied away from dark themes in their games before, but they're usually done so a little more abstractly. Final Fantasy IX is a good example of this, which hides quite dark themes beneath its cutesy exterior, but does so often in a bit more of a poetic way, and definitely without much in the way of explicit bloodshed. There is a strong focus in Final Fantasy XVI on Clive's character and his development. You experience the game almost entirely from his perspective and see firsthand his growth over the years. His growth from a brave, if somewhat innocent teenager in the prologue to a broken, revenge-driven man 13 years later, to a more matured and confident man in his 30s. The character growth and development are spot on. Clive is a fantastic protagonist, and coming back to the beginning of the story for New Game Plus after finishing the game really hammered home how much this character changed as the story went on. The first third of the game's runtime is a very personal story, focused mostly on Clive's quest for revenge, along with him figuring out his place in the world. By the end, the story is what you'd expect from Final Fantasy, world-ending stakes which end up being ultimately a battle of philosophies, the strength of will versus determinism. Despite the stakes, the story never loses that focus on being character-driven. Clive drives the plot forward with his decisions, and objectives are driven by himself or the actions of others causing him to steer directions. He will probably rank very highly amongst the pantheon of Final Fantasy protagonists for me. Clive isn't the sole focus of the story though, he is joined by various companions, and some of these characters will probably rank among my favourites in the series. From Clive's childhood friend Jill, whose experience of being Shiva's dominant has left its scars, to Sid with his charming wit and leadership qualities, to even supporting characters like Gav, who brings down-to-earth vibes and casual comic relief where it's needed. Even some of the recurring characters you meet in the Hideaway or some of the towns can leave an impact on you. I wish that some of these characters got more screen time or development though. There are parts of the story where I wish it would stick with a character or a moment a bit longer, or have given them an extra scene or two to flesh them out a tad more. This is something that Final Fantasy XV admittedly does better than 16. The constant chatter in 15 means that you had a good grasp of the personalities and relationships between the four Chocobros, whereas that is largely missing in 16. Granted, there is a lot more cutscenes in this game which do a lot of the character work instead. There is still a bit of banter, but it's mostly triggered dialogue as you go through an environment, or the occasional comment post-battle. Nothing really like the random idle chatter from 15. This can mean that there are stretches of pretty much silence between Clive and whoever he's travelling with. I can't say too much without spoilers, but there can be an issue with the pacing of the story overall. Some parts of the story are simply not elaborated on further. Granted, these are mostly small details where it's not completely vital to know to understand the story, but the pacing of the tale seems to sometimes leave some details behind at times. Details of what goes on in the time skips can be somewhat vague, for example, sometimes feeling like some things in the world have mostly just frozen still during the interim. A spoiler-free example for me is that I think I felt this way because, even after a 5-year gap, characters are still wearing the same outfits. It's only a small detail really, but I feel a slight change in wardrobe would have helped sell the passage of time a little bit more. Granted, Clive looks believably older, but he's the only character granted this attention to detail. But he's the main character, so I understand why the developers focused on him more than anybody else. Overall, I love the story of this game. The cutscenes are beautiful, the voice acting is phenomenal, and the script is really well localized. That last point isn't a surprise considering his team's work on Final Fantasy XIV. The pacing of the story isn't always exactly where it should be. There are certainly times when the pacing between the high-octane set pieces feels a touch too long, but this is partly due to me taking a very completionist approach and doing everything I could between these missions too. I'm going to quickly discuss some parts of the story which require talking about spoilers now, so go to the timestamp on the screen or click the chapter on the video to skip ahead if you're not interested. Okay? Last warning. Alright, let's get to it. Firstly, I'm very glad that the story didn't drag out the revenge plotline for very long and resolved it quite quickly. I thought it was quite obvious, not only from the marketing but from the end of the prologue itself, that Clive was the one that killed the Phoenix. Clive clearly was the one who transformed into Ifrit, albeit not out of choice due to the influence of another, so I guess he was half right. What this culminates in was a brilliant exploration of Clive facing his own shadow, to take responsibility for what happened. Even though he wasn't in control when it happened, he was still the person who did the deed, and I think this approach to facing the past is quite a mature exploration of the subject. At first, he's filled with rage and hatred towards this perceived other. Even his mentor in Sid tries to steer him away from this self-destructive path. When he learns for himself that he is in fact Ifrit, which is another aspect I loved, that he figured out for himself rather than someone telling him, that rage turns inward. He spent a large chunk of his time fantasizing over getting this revenge on another he blamed for his own actions. This initially manifests as apathy and an almost suicidal mindset. He begs to be killed by Sid. He looks a little too long off a bridge to a running river, but his connections to others always drags him out of it. Torgal, Sid, Gav, Jill. These connections with others bring him back from the thoughts, and he continues. Jill especially is great for this. She acts as his rock. She reassures that they'll face his trauma together, and together they'll fight through it. It's quite beautiful, really. The pair are fantastic in this aspect in that they show an honestly quite realistic relationship between two broken people who do their best to support one another. Clive eventually faces the day of Phoenix Gate and fights a manifestation of himself, symbolising his acceptance of the truth, prompted through gameplay, maybe in a bit of a cheesy way, but the way the music swells and the visuals more than makes up for it.
It's time to find out who we are, once and for all. Show yourself, Ifrit.
Only once he takes responsibility for what he did, the truth of the whole thing, can he finally focus on the future and what truly matters in the world. He killed Joshua unwillingly, but that doesn't change the fact that he is a second dominant of fire, that someone else was definitely there, and there are other powers at play in this world. He then uses the rest of the first half of the game finding his new purpose in life, something he never could have done without first moving through his own trauma. I absolutely love this kind of stuff in stories. It's part of why I've loved the Persona series too, as the acceptance of having these dark thoughts, of the shadow that lives within us all, can we truly exist as a whole person? And it certainly doesn't define us either. I mentioned her earlier, so let's chat about Jill for a bit. I really like her character, and I like her relationship with Clive. I've heard some sentiment that her chemistry with Clive and her overall contribution to the story are quite low. I disagree. Jill is quiet, yes. She's quite withdrawn as a person due in large part to her trauma. Her romance with Clive is slow. It's so clear that these two people feel something for each other. However, these are two very broken people. Jill has spent the most of the 13-year time jump being used as a weapon for the Iron Kingdom. Abused and threatened to turn into Shiva in order to kill for them, in order to save her peers. She's killed so many people, she's become quite indifferent to it all. You can see in the opening, she has a look of apathy on her face, and with the context from later in the game, she wants to die in this battle. She sees herself as becoming a monster as she willingly partook in the killing, and it's affected her in a similar way that it affected Clive. Her trauma caused her to disassociate herself from these actions by attributing them to another within herself, talking about those events in the third person. She feels she has to atone for her sins, of what she did in assistance of the Iron Kingdom, and she gets it.
I have killed the monster and become an outlaw. May the blessing of the crystals go with you.
Clive, just as she did for him, helps her where he can and agrees to face her past together when the mission comes to destroying their mother crystal. Her act of vengeance was not like Clive's though. She sought not pure revenge but atonement. Killing the leader of the cult was personal to Jill because she felt that she basically enabled his existence, and killing him was a way to stop his horror from existing in the world, to end the suffering of others in his grasp, who she also cared for. She called herself a monster, but he was the monster all along. It's not until after this arc with Jill that her and Clive seem to get properly closer. With them both able to move past their trauma, they can feel more comfortable with each other, which feels quite genuine for an intimate relationship like this, with the type of people these two people are. One of the final major scenes between the two of them is near the end, when they're both naked on the beach. The nudity is very tasteful, to be honest, it's not gratuitous, and it symbolises how honest they're being with each other. Jill basically asks Clive to take Shiva from her, to take her powers from her, powers which she feels are a burden. Not only do they remind her of her worst days, to the point that she hates priming into Shiva full stop, but the amount of time she's been forced to do it in the past is literally killing her. Giving these powers to Clive, putting her trust in him to help him overpower the threat to come, is a culmination of the trust she's put into him. Ultima is an interesting antagonist. He's basically the reason that almost all of the events in the story happen, manipulating things from behind the scenes. Playing through the game again, you notice this more as well, as you're more able to spot the telltale signs of Ultima's meddling. He's the opposite of Clive, where Clive is optimistic, Ultima is pessimistic. Clive's ultimate goal ends up being collectivism and hope for the future. Ultima represents selfish individualism and cynicism. Ultima is pretty much behind every major plot point of the game, and in a way that surprisingly mostly makes sense too. Ultima created humanity and the Mother Crystals with the goal being for one of these humans to become what he refers to as mythos, a vessel he can enter which can withstand the ether of all the Mother Crystals in order for him to resurrect his fallen race. He sees himself above the humans, but the point of the story is to show that this self-proclaimed god is just as flawed as his creations. He created humanity and as such reflect his own ways, especially with the way humans treat bearers. In this way, humanity most replicates the behaviour of their creator. They see those they deem as lesser and use them only as tools. For humans, the bearers light their torches and braziers. For Ultima, he manipulates humanity in order to breed chaos and war to lure out his precious mythos. The difference between them, though, is the connections humans have with each other, which lead to people wanting to better themselves. Humanity isn't perfect, and how they treat bearers is unforgivable, but the chance to change is there through their consciousness. Ultima rejects this side of himself, fails to see that he too is as flawed as his creations, and continues to act without empathy or reflection. The final fight is awesome too, with Clive showing his mastery of the various elements against their creator, and finishing it all by dropping the closest this series will probably ever get to a title drop.
The world you see is but a fantasy! The only fantasy here is yours. And we shall be its final witness.
I really love the dynamic between Clive and Joshua. Having a younger brother myself certainly helps me empathise with their relationship. At times I disagree, but it's always for the other's best interest. Joshua doesn't want Clive to bear the weight of responsibility alone, and he's constantly scolding him for doing this. The flashback at the end of the game where it shows Clive meeting his newborn brother and seeing the love flood into his face instantly is something I can definitely relate to. It shows in how Clive is so eager to protect his brother, and how heartbroken he was when he thought he'd been killed. I'd feel that way too. Shout out to Ben Starr for his brilliant performance as Clive. The ending of the game is intentionally ambiguous. Origin collapses, Jill feels like Meteor has shown a bad omen and her prayers have gone unanswered for Clive's safe return. Clive is shown on a beach with his hand turning to stone from the crystal's curse, insinuating that the final spell to eliminate magic from the world worked. The fate of everyone is left unanswered, with an epilogue showing a book named Final Fantasy, written by Joshua Rossfield. Does that mean he lived? I don't think so personally. The side quests I feel answer a lot of the questions the ending leaves open. Clive is gifted a quill by Tomes and is encouraged to write a book about his journey once everything is done. Clive's left hand turns to stone, but only after he tried to summon fire with it, with further petrification ceasing. Since he's right-handed, he could still write. Clive has a history of honouring others' names by taking on their mantle. He spends a lot of the second half of the game being referred to as Sid. So he could have used Joshua's name as a pen name to honour his late brother, and the title refers to what I mentioned earlier of this game's practical name drop. The final fantasy was Ultima's, and so is the tale of its dissolution. Meteor, in my opinion, was linked to Ultima in some way. It hangs in the sky near the moon in the same location, hinting to me that it's not a natural star, and maybe the ship that houses Ultima's race. Its light fading with the destruction of Origin can't be coincidence. even if Jill misinterprets it as a bad omen. This, to me, kind of further adds to the theme of false gods, as she put faith in something that wasn't even benevolent, and so read too much into something she maybe shouldn't have. As is common for this franchise, the music for Final Fantasy XVI is superb. Composed by Masayoshi Soken of Final Fantasy XIV fame, he brings his all to this OST. The soundtrack covers all the bases from light and emotional pieces, cheeky rebellious guitar-focused melodies, and some of the most epic high-octane boss music I've heard in a very long time. While Soken's previous and most recent work in Shadowbringers and Endwalker expansions have a rock influence with electric guitars, the tracks in Final Fantasy XVI lean more on percussion to bring out the heavy, hard hitters, with good use of choir to enhance these moments. There are tracks that make use of electrical instruments and synth, however they're saved more for the stranger, almost otherworldly moments where it makes more sense. Combined with the visuals, this OST is an absolute treat, and helps create some of the most epic moments in action media I've seen in quite some time. Some examples. The game starts strong with Away Overture. Shows its more mellow side later on with Lovely, Dark and Deep. One of the memorable acoustic led tracks which doubles as a character theme in Hide, Hide Away. The boss theme is always fun to listen to when fighting, named On the Shoulder of Giants. There are piano-led tracks such as Not Alone, which hint at the delicacy and tragedy of Jill's character. And finally, the most bombastic and hype music to play games to, Find the Flame, which acts as the base of Clive's theme music, as well as hyping up every moment as used it. So let's conclude this video. Is Final Fantasy XVI flawless? No. Could it have been better in places? Probably. Does that matter? To me, not really. What we got was a focused and extremely well polished roller coaster that gives you what you put into it. Sure, the game is not very hard or complex, especially by action game standards, nor does it have an overly deep RPG system. The complexities and RPG elements are there though, even if they don't manifest in ways that you may have expected. This is still thoroughly a Final Fantasy game though. The themes and the story and music and even the gameplay in a way evoke the spirit of the series undoubtedly. There are legitimate issues I can probably agree with, but I think what's more important than any of that is that Square Enix and CBU3 in particular have crafted a very memorable experience. There are moments in the story I look back on fondly, and I'll always remember how cool it felt to pull off a nice chain of attacks without taking any damage. The story is earnest and focuses on emotion heavily, which I found extremely drawn to, and I love the characters. There's no way I can come even close to calling this a bad game. I'll take this flawed but memorable experience over a polished nothing burger, like a generic open world Ubisoft game or something. So where would I rank this game against the others? The final question I asked myself in this review. I think this is actually quite easy to place in my rankings, to be honest. I definitely overall prefer this game to Final Fantasy 15. The game has strengths where that game has weaknesses and vice versa, but I think 16 easily wins in that comparison. I come to a block when placing it above 5 though, with 5 having what I would consider the pinnacle of the ATB and job system gameplay, and as such being the most replayable. I placed 14 above that because I feel the story is better, and while the gameplay is different of course, it's also a best in class for its genre. So that goes above 5 for being good at 2 things over 1. I really like 16, however I don't think I can place it above 5 due to the gameplay. I like the gameplay a lot, but I can't justify putting it above what, by my own admission, is some of the best gameplay in the series. I also really like the story in the 16, which would put it above 5 for me too, but the thing is that as much as I like it, I don't think it's enough to topple the replayability of 5. That puts it at number 8, above 15, because I simply like it more. This is a much more confident and polished product than 15 was when it released. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the founder of Final Fantasy, has always said, even before he left Square, and even quite recently, that Final Fantasy isn't defined by its gameplay alone. Heck, one of his early answers to the question, what joins all the Final Fantasy games together, was blue text boxes. While he was kind of joking with that answer, he has always never mentioned the gameplay system being the defining factor of the series, instead always saying that FF is the best game the developers feel that they can make at the time. This time they leaned into the action element and made the best action RPG they felt they could make, and that boldness, that will to be daring, is what makes Final Fantasy what it is. No other series reinvents itself like this one, and I hope that continues in the future. Thanks for watching.